Okay, welcome everyone to our Excel series, the fourth in our series, which is Pivot Tables. So my name is Meredith. I'm a librarian at Harrington Library, and I have my chat moderator, Sharon, who is also one of our librarians over here. If you have any questions, you'll be able to put those in the chat box, and Sharon will either answer them directly or share them with me. She may also hold them till the end of the program, depending on what the topic is about. We are going to have our mics, your mics turned off, so questions definitely need to go into the chat. We will also have a follow-up email with a recording of today's program so that if you don't get a chance to follow along today, or if you need to review anything, you can do so. It'll come to you in a few business days, along with a link to our sample workbook. So if you want to follow along with us today, we have our sample workbook, which is available on our Google Drive. Let me drop that in the chat real quick for you, unless Sharon already has that link. Let's see. You should have also gotten this link in your registration email, but just in case, easy access. There we go. And so to save it for your own use, you'll want to go to the file that says Pivot Table Workbook, and then you'll right click on it and do download, and make sure to download it as an Excel file, and that'll give you access to it. So what should you know to get the most out of this program? Basically, basic navigation of the worksheet is super handy, as well as if you know how to enter and format data to create a usable data set. That will definitely give you a head start. If you've had a chance to watch our other 3 programs, those will have given you some tools that will help with this program as well. So let's get started. So what is a pivot table? So a pivot table is a powerful and flexible table. It's similar in look to your standard table, but it has the ability to summarize your data set either from a worksheet that you've already created or something that you've imported from another source, such as our example here. I got all of this data from a different source, and then I altered it a little to work towards our program. It is something that allows you to easily organize and rearrange or pivot your data to meet your needs at the drop of a hat. It basically does all of the work of having to have formulas and functions to get summaries of your data. And it does that all in the background for you based on how you set it up. So we'll go over a few ways of how to set it up to get some great summarized data. So our data for today, we're using a sample here of salespeople for a company that sells sweet treats, kind of like Hostess cupcakes or something like that. And they sell them to various convenience stores and grocery stores, businesses that are going to sell them to customers. It's a very large data set, which is why I got the data from somewhere else. If I had created my own data, this would have taken forever because there are, I believe, 930 cells in here covering 2 whole years of sales. And that's where pivot tables really shine, is when you have a big set of data. I mean, they can work great for smaller sets, and they'll still do what they need to do. But when you have so much data that it's hard to really get anything from what you're looking at, that's where pivot tables are really great. So just an example of how you can do a table on your own with formulas. We've got this lovely little example over here where I used formulas to get the total numbers of each of the different products that were sold by each of the sales representatives, their totals over here, the totals for the products, and then the grand total. But to do this, we had to painstakingly write out the equations or the formulas. And if we wanted to change anything about this, we'd have to go back in and adjust each individual cell. We couldn't just change it at the drop of a hat. which, you know, would be nice to do, especially if you're talking to somebody and you want to demonstrate a different set of information while you're talking instead of having to say, let me get back to you with an email. So best thing to do for preparing our data. So we've got all of our data here, and we want to make sure that it doesn't have any blank spaces, because if you have blank rows, blank columns, or blank cells, that can throw a monkey wrench in how Excel formulates things and how well it makes the pivot table. It can cause errors. Sometimes Excel can get past it and, you know, keep chugging along, but there's other times where it cannot handle that. So it's best to make sure that your data is 100% devoid of blanks. If you've worked with your data recently, then you probably know there's no blanks. But if this is something that, you know, you're at the end of the year and you're wanting to run some reports and you have no idea, always better safe than sorry. And you can do that by highlighting all your data, which you can do Control-A to highlight everything. And that'll get all of the information highlighted. And I did forget to mention, we're currently working in Excel 2016. So if you're working in a different, either a later version or earlier version like 2013 or 2010, or if you're working on the online version, which is Excel 365, there may be some differences in capabilities. They should look fairly similar, and the names for the different stuff should match up nicely, but there are some features that 2016 has that the others don't. So if you're having trouble doing that, it might be due to the difference in additions. So to navigate the entirety of our data, we can actually move around using Control plus the period key. That's the one that has the little period and the little caret arrow on it. And that will let you move from one corner to the next of your highlighted data. And see, it was 910 that we have, not 930 cells. And this comes in handy when you're wanting to make sure that you have everything highlighted as you move forward. And you can check. You can also scroll, which is painstakingly slow, but if it's been a while, it may be worth it to double check and make sure that everything is filled. All right, so we've got a full data set. We're happy to move on. So in earlier editions, you actually had to make a table in order to then go on to a pivot table. These days, it's optional, but I recommend it, especially if you're planning on looking back at your data at all, because it automatically inserts filters and it makes it a little easier to look at and navigate. So we're going to do that real quick. It'll be a reminder from our previous class. So you want to just make sure that there's one cell highlighted in your data. You don't have to highlight the whole thing, fortunately. Come up here to Insert, and then Table. And since we navigated the whole data set, we know that 910 is exactly where we want to end our table. And we also want to make sure that our table headers are noted. So the checkbox needs to be filled. Fortunately, that's the default. So we hit OK. And now we have a handy dandy table. It looks like I had some formatting on here, so I'm going to clear that out real quick so it's all the same. So we're going to make sure that our font is all the same color. There we go. Okay, so we've got our table and we've got our filters that will let us look at specific people, specific products, regions, customers, so on and so forth. So if we needed to go back to the data and make sure that it was coming across to our pivot table correctly, it's now easy to do that. Are there any questions on creating a table?
Not at this time.
Okay. Then we'll move right along. And like I said, this is entirely optional. It depends on what you're wanting to do with your data as you move along. So from here, the limitations to just a basic table is that you really can't see what all of these numbers mean in the long run. It doesn't summarize anything for you, but you can narrow down and see specific details of information, which can be handy. So we'll move on to creating our actual pivot table. So again, you'll want your single cell within the table to be highlighted. Doesn't matter where, just as long as it's in the table. And we're going to go back up to insert here. And on our insert ribbon, we have pivot tables at the very beginning here. You can do recommended pivot tables, which may meet your needs, but we're going to go from scratch. This will pre-insert different fields into your pivot table. So it uses algorithms to figure that out. Sometimes they're spot on, sometimes it's not what you need. So we're going to focus on starting from nothing.
Meredith,
So we'll click on yes.
Do you have a minute just for a quick question?
Sure.
There's a request to repeat how you copied that table, the entire table. We have some people that were a little late.
Okay, you can, so in the chat, and Sharon, if you can reshare that, because I believe people who come in after that got sent aren't going to see the link.
Correct.
Yeah, so there's a link to our—
to copy the whole table, I think. I miscommunicated.
So they're wanting to—
So there's somebody who would like a shortcut key to check if the whole table is selected. You know, how did you copy that whole table?
Well, so when, so if you're wanting to just highlight the whole table, as long as there's not any other information in either the column or the row on the other side of the table, when you're inside the table and you hit Control A, it'll automatically highlight the whole thing. Right now, because it's already been converted into an actual table instead of just a set of data, it's not highlighting the headers, but let me back it up just so you can see that. We'll bounce back a little bit. There we go. So when I hit Control A, it highlights the whole table. And then if you wanted to, you could copy it from how it's highlighted now. When you're making the table itself, it does the same thing as Control A basically, and figures out that the table is basically all of the cells that have stuff in it until you get to the point that there are no cells that have stuff in it. That's the basic, very simplified version of how it figures it out. So when you hit table, it will automatically do A1 to H910. If for some reason, say you accidentally, were outside of it when you hit make a table, and this didn't come up correctly, you can always hit the little tool button here, which lets you select on your own. And you can select manually by clicking and dragging. You can also do Control A to highlight stuff as well. But it's easiest if you can to just be in the table itself and hit the table button, and it'll autofill for you. And then, okay. Does that make sense? Did that answer the question? Did I hit the right points?
Yeah.
Okay. So, there. Okay, so back to making our pivot table. So just like the pivot table is on the insert ribbon and has its own button. You'll notice that the table button, because it is already a table, is grayed out. So our pivot table, we'll click on it and it auto selects just like the table did. You'll see it says that it's using table 2. As long as it's already put into a table, that's what it'll use. If you're using just the data without it being in table format, it will say the range just like we had with the table before. So you want to make sure that's correct. Table 2 is correct. We want all that information. And then you get the option of choosing where it's going to put that pivot table. So you can either create a new worksheet, which will go on the bottom row here, or you can put it in an existing worksheet, like right here if we wanted to. The downside to using it in an existing worksheet is if you've got all this information already in here, it makes it a bit crowded. A lot of times with pivot tables, it's nice to have it on its own so that it's the only thing being focused on when you're talking about it or presenting it. But if you're wanting to manipulate the data right next to your data set so that you can see it easily, that's always an option. Today, we're going to do a new worksheet. So you just make sure that that's selected and then hit OK. And you'll see we get a new sheet 1 down here. And we get a little placeholder for our pivot table. Because we haven't selected any of our data to go into the various places yet, you get just this little blank guy right here that just kind of holds the space until we're ready. So any questions so far on how we got here?
All's good right now.
Okay, so then we'll move on to how we get into working with the data. So whenever you create a pivot table, you get a little pane that pops up here on the side called the pivot table fields. So the fields are all of the column headers from our previous document or our previous data set. So you'll see if we come up to the top here, all of these headers translate into the fields over here. And these fields can be placed into 4 different areas. So we have our column area, which means that that information would be across the top. Our rows information, which would be the stuff that goes down vertically. Values are what basically the numerical value that we're working with for the rows and columns. And it sounds confusing now, but once we put stuff in place, it'll make a little more sense. And then our final one is filters. And this will let us, if we wanted to, filter the data to meet our needs. It's very similar to the filter button at the top of our tables, like this, except it focuses specifically on one of these headers. And we'll play around with that in just a bit. So there's 2 ways to get your fields into your areas here. If you select it by hitting the checkbox, depending on what type of information it is, it will get put into either rows or columns automatically. So you can click on different items. We actually are going to make ours to look just like this table here. So we've got our salesperson, and we want that to be in the rows, which it automatically did, so that was handy. I am personally a fan of dragging and dropping, which is the other way you can do it. So any numerical numbers, when you click, will go into columns. Any non-numerical will go into rows, but you can just move it yourself by dragging and dropping. So to get our setup, we want products to go in columns. So now we've got our people, our salespeople, and we've got our products. And then we also want to have our value that we're working with. And what did we use here? We used number of cases rather than dollar values. So we'll come back over here and bring down our number of cases to our values. And automatically, we have got our table that looks just like this table. And you can see our grand total is 7,997. And over here, well, I jumped too far. There we are. We've got 7,997. And so instead of having to type out all of those formulas that we had on that previous table, the pivot table automatically does it for us. So any questions about moving fields around?
Not at the moment.
Okay, well, we're going to have a little more fun with moving things around just to see how we can pivot the data to get different results. So instead of number of cases, we're going to switch it out for item cost. So you can either get rid of the value by dragging and removing it out here where you get a little X sign and it just takes it out. Or you can also use the little drop down to remove the field, and that'll take it out. And you can bring your item cost down instead. And we've replaced our cases with the amount of money or the total cost of the products for each product that has been brought in by each employee. Now, if you wanted to have both of the item cost and the cases, you can do that at the same time. It just spreads it out very far. I mean, fortunately, our data here still fits within our window, but if you keep adding stuff here, it gets longer and longer. So you'll see that it has a little subgroup. So you've got your product, and you've got your sum of item cost to one side, and then your number of cases to the other side. If you wanted to have it the other way around, you can simply drag and move the number of cases first, and it'll flip-flop those. But we're focusing on one bit of information at a time, so we're going to remove our number of cases and just look at our totals. Now, with such big numbers, we don't really need these decimal points. And it might be nice to have the $sign in front of our numbers so that we know what kind of money we're working with. So you can change that by coming up to, you want to make sure you've clicked the numbers in here, and you want to highlight all of them. I believe it will individually work on each cell, but if you want to get it all done at once, it's much better to highlight all of your data at once, including our totals. And we come up here to the number formatting, and you can change it. Different currencies, we're working with, of course, dollars. So we can click that. And then it, of course, automatically gives it the 2 decimal points for the change that we work with. But with these big numbers, that's really unnecessary. So we can remove decimal points down here with these little shortcuts, and we can take away those decimal points. And what it does is it automatically rounds the numbers either up or down based on standard rounding rules. So our item that was $7,999.50 automatically rounds up to 8,000, which when you're working with big numbers like this is really all you need. You don't need those little minute details. You can also tinker with the formatting a little more if you want to by opening up using the little drop down extra corner caret thing here to get into very specifics of numbers. So you can do currency specifically, accounting options, and the like. Now, when you do that, it turns off the automatic formatting feature for our numbers. So sometimes those numbers will stay the same. Let's see if it does that. If we take out our items and put back in our cases, will it keep the $signs? Yep, it will. But we don't want $signs because we're working with cases, which is not money. So you can change it back to either general, which kind of automatically formats, or basic numbers, which is up here. And then again, you'll want to remove those decimal places because we don't need those. There are no partial cases in our business. So that's some basic formatting for getting it to look kind of more like you want it to. Any questions about that?
No questions right now.
Awesome. Well, then we'll keep chugging along. We can also add our customers to the column section. So let's say we want to we'll stick with cases because they're a nice, easy number to deal with, not too hard on the eyes. And we'll move our customers down into our column section. We're going to add it with our products so that we have information. So for each product, we'll see which customer bought how many items from which employee. You'll notice that there's a teeny tiny itty bitty little box here that's a little minus sign. Let me zoom in so you can see it a little better. So by each of the products. So you can actually click on this to shrink it so that you see the grand totals, or your other option is to double click the cell, which is a lot easier to do because that is a very teeny tiny little bitty button. So if you double click, it'll expand and shrink up your data. So if you have multiple items either in your columns and rows, you'll get the ability to expand and collapse the data. So 2 ways to do that. Double clicking is honestly the easiest because when it's at normal size viewing, it can get kind of challenging to click that itty bitty square. Let me get back to our 100% view here. There we go. Something to note about the fields pane. If you're ever outside of the table, it goes away. When you come back in, it pops back up. If you ever accidentally close it, then it won't come back up when you navigate between the two. All you have to do is come over here to analysis, and there's your field list, which is what we were working with. So analysis and design are specific tools for pivot table. So when you're on a pivot table, these ribbons will show up. When you're outside of the pivot table, they go away. So you have the option to bring that field list. And you can also get rid of the collapsing and expanding buttons if you don't want to use them and you just want to stick to double clicking. If you'd rather visually have it without them, that is an option. You'll still be able to collapse them and expand them by double clicking. So, any questions about that so far?
No questions.
Awesome. Then we'll just keep chugging along. You can also move the order, just like we did with the value of our columns. So if instead of wanting to see for each product what company purchased, we can also flip that around and see for what company which items they purchased, if that makes sense. I think it'll make more sense when I actually do it. So let's flip-flop it. We just click and drag so that customer is above product. And now we can see Happy Mart bought chocolate cream cakes from these employees in this quantity, and you can see that for all of the different products. And then you can see the total. So it just rearranges the order of the information so that you can see based on what you're interested in. So if you're focusing on the customer rather than the product, it's better to have the customer at top. Whereas if you're looking at the product, you'd want that one to be in the top. We can also do that with rows. So we're going to move our customer over to our rows section to see what that looks like. And now we can see a breakdown for each employee, their dealings with various companies. So the customers, their grand totals at the top here for their products, and then what each company bought to make that grand total. So something to also note is we can change the way this is laid out, because right now we've got our totals at the top and we've got no lines breaking anything up, which could be a little challenging to look at. So if we come over to our design section for our pivot table tools, our report layout is going to have a few different options. The default is typically the show in compact form. And what that does is it kind of scrunches things up a little more, makes it a little easier to look at on a screen. But if you're wanting to change it up a little bit, you can also pick show in outline form, which spreads it out a little more, but it does automatically put the titles for the various columns and rows in place. I'll back it up so you can see. This one just has column labels and row labels, whereas outline form goes ahead and labels those for you. And it spreads it out a little bit more so you can see it kind of more spread out. My personal favorite is the tabular form, because this is where you get to have the nice lines in it. Now, one difference in the tabular form is that you do have the total moved to the bottom rather than the top of the grouping. So Meg Benson's totals are down here at the bottom instead of right by her name. So those are some quick ways to change the way it looks to meet your needs. If you did want to keep the compact form because it is so much smaller and easier to work with, if you're wanting to presented and you have limited space, you can change the column label and row labels to meet your needs. All you have to do is click on it and then type in what you'd like it to be. So this would be product. And then we have sales person. And there we have our headers like we wanted. So that way it keeps it compact without having to do anything to change how it's spread out and still get our headers for our rows and columns. Any questions on that part?
No questions.
Awesome. So we'll get a little more into design because design is fun. It can help make the data match a presentation you're doing, or just make it easier on your eyes, depending on how you feel about it. So we're going to come up to our design tab here. We have options of having the row headers and the column headers. You can also do banded rows. So when you have no lines present, this is extra helpful. When you click on that, it gives it a banded coloration. You can also have banded columns, but if you do that while you have banded rows, it looks a little weird. So I recommend either one or the other, because otherwise you get these lovely solid blocks that are just kind of odd. You also have some preset styles that you can work with over here. And just hovering over them will let you see what they end up looking like. And they do have different looks based on whether or not you have the banded rows selected. And you can see what some of them look like there, like that. There's an expanding button here, or you can scroll depending on how you're wanting to look. If you expand it out, you can preview to your heart's content to see which of these you like. These are kind of the lighter designs. They're not quite as in your face. You've got some medium ones that have some darker colors that kind of stand out a little more. And then you have the really dark ones that have a lot more color to them. And so you can pick what really works best for you. You can get quite colorful. So that's our designs there. Any questions on that?
No questions.
Okay. If you're the type of person who doesn't like having this pivot table field to take up all of your space, you can pop it out by, when you come up at the top, you get a little 4 arrow mouse icon, and you can click and drag it to disconnect it. And so if you have multiple screens, or say you just want to tuck it into the top corner over here so it's a little more out of the way, or move it to the other side, you can do that. It can also be docked on the other side, where if you tap on the side of the screen, it'll dock it into place. To get it back, of course, I have 2 monitors, so this is going to be a bit of a challenge. I have to find that secret spot where it will let me dock it back. See if I can do that. Come on. There we go. If you're working with just 1 monitor, as long as you go to the edge of your monitor, it will dock into place. If you have 2, it just kind of keeps going over into the second monitor, which can be handy. It gives you more table to work with in that situation. All right, so we'll move on then. We've gotten our designs looked at. If you change your information in your original data set, say that you've realized that, let's look at our original data set. Let's say we realized that Terry's name is really Terry with a Y and not Terry with an I, and we've been spelling it wrong for 2 years and we feel really bad about it and we want to update it. We can do so. First off, what we can do to get the data set right here, instead of having to painstakingly look for Mallory Terry throughout the whole list, we can come up here to our Find and Select tool, click on that, and we want to do Replace. And so we're going to copy, so Control-C, that data, and put it in here. So we're looking for this specific spelling, and then we're going to replace it with Terry with a Y. So we've got that set up. We're going to replace all of them. So we'll replace all. And we've got 79 replacements that got made. Now, if we come back over to our pivot table, you'll notice, let me find Terry because he's in alphabetical order, that it still has the I. So we need to update that. So we have to refresh our data. To do that, we have to come up here to our pivot table tools, back to analyze, and you'll see refresh right here. And this will update our data. So when we hit that, and you'll also notice that any changes that happen end up typically getting moved to the bottom. So Terry's down here, he's not in alphabetical order anymore. We can easily fix that by making sure that we sort A to Z with our little drop down there. So that'll put him back in place. You can use these little drop downs just like the filters in the tables. You can use it to select specific information. So if you wanted to specifically look at just one or two products instead of all of them, you can deselect by hitting the select all checkbox and then pick the ones that you want. And it'll narrow down the data. And you'll see the little filter changes up at the top. If you want to clear your filters, you can just come up here to clear filters and it will remove those. So that is some basic tools there. We also have filters over here, but we're going to get into that in just a moment. First, we want to look at grouping. Grouping is very handy, especially when you're working with dates or information that you want to look at the total of. So we're going to move down to our date grouping tab over here. So I have set up a data or a pivot table with the data we need that has regions in the columns. In the rows area, we've got date. And in the value section, we have number of cases. Now, I set this up specifically to look like our some of the older versions because a lot of them, when you put date in there, do this very long list of every single day that is in the data set. 2016 has taken a lovely step forward and will automatically group for you. So I'm going to remove the date here and I'm going to bring it back down so you can see the auto grouping. So when I bring it back into rows, it automatically groups it by years, quarters, and the one that says date here is the months. So we can expand that out so you can see it. And it does that by default. So if you were wanting to keep the dates, if you wanted to see every single day, you can do that by selecting one of the grouped sections. A cell in any of them should work. And then you right click and come down here to group. And that is where we're going to do a lot of our work to change different groupings. You have a lot of options with date grouping. You have year all the way to seconds. So depending on what kind of data you've got, if you need to be very specific, you can group it by seconds. And you can select multiple groups to have. So you see we have the 3 that automatically got selected. We can deselect them as well and bring it back to our days, which was the original one, and hit OK. And that will have our date information. So if you're working with an older version that doesn't automatically group, just like we did to ungroup those, we can come in here and again, click on any of the cells in the date area. You don't have to highlight all of them. And then right click to group. And this is where we can select our months, quarters, and years manually. So you can always do that on your own. Now you'll notice that it does change the header for years and quarters, but it does not for months. Whatever the smallest amount is, it keeps it as date. So if you want that to actually represent the months, you can just click on it and type in month. And now it's labeled correctly. And again, we can expand and collapse these. If you expand one of the larger groupings, it'll apply to the smaller ones. So like, for example, if we collapsed Q1, it's going to collapse Q1 for all of our 2 years here. If we collapsed the years, of course, it would collapse just the year. But anything in between, it closes the smaller ones up for you. We can also change the order that they're arranged in. Let's say, we have it all nice and neat. We can see the quarters, we can see the months, but we'd really like to focus on looking at how January was for each year. So we can get rid of our quarters by dragging it out here. And you'll note if we don't ungroup the items, it keeps the quarters in the pivot table field, so you could use that later. I'll show you how to get rid of it from the field list if you're done with it and you don't want to work with it anymore in just a moment. So now we've got our months and our years, which is handy, but we want to be able to see each month comparatively across the 2 years. So we can switch month and years. And now we can see in January of 2019, we did okay, but we did a lot better in 2020. And so that way you can easily compare side by side the numbers for different months, and you can look at it based on the regions in this table. Any questions on working with grouping?
Well, there are a couple of questions in general.
Okay.
Can you have only one pivot on a tab or multiple pivots?
Oh, you mean on a worksheet?
Let's see, Scott is the one who asked that question. Is that correct, Scott?
So like maybe this pivot table here, and if you wanted to manipulate the data in a different way, have it over here. Yeah, you can definitely do that. When you create your, let me pull up our original data set here. You can create additional pivot tables by just coming back and doing what we did for our first one, and then select existing worksheet. And we can pick, say we wanted them side by side in our date grouping area. You can either use the drop down to select, or you can click on the actual tabs themselves. And it should, it's been a while since I've done this, so we'll see what happens, but it should allow you to have 2 pivot tables. So we'll just hit enter and okay. And now you've got your other table that you can work with. And depending on which ones you've selected, the pivot fields will represent what's being done in that specific pivot table. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Awesome.
So there was one other question just saying in regards to, can we have pivot tables also using the Google Drive, I guess, maybe Sheets?
Yes, Google Sheets does have pivot tables, and we actually have got a couple of classes about that in our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in seeing how it applies in Google Sheets, I would check that out. I actually taught those classes, and I can tell you there's some key differences between the two. Google Sheets is a little bit behind in some of the features that are offered through Excel, but there are workarounds and ways to make it work very similar to Excel. And they do have pivot table feature as part of their toolkit. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. I think that did.
Okay. So let's see. Is there anything left in our date grouping that I didn't cover? Oh, yes. So I mentioned getting rid of our extra fields that popped up because we grouped. Just like we got rid of the groupings at the very beginning, when you come back over here and select group, you can also do ungroup, which brings it back to just the date. And that'll get rid of everything. But if you wanted to say specifically just get rid of quarters, you like years, you like months, but you don't see much use in having quarters, you can right click and go to group and then just deselect quarters, and it'll get rid of it off of your list. So you don't have to deal with extra stuff there that you don't plan to use. And let's see. Oh, and final one. This is one of those features that I mentioned that Google doesn't have, that Excel does. The ability to group by a set period of time. So we're going to come back into our grouping option here, get that pop-up window. So we want to do, let's say, pay periods. Those will be by days, and typically, you either have a week or 2 weeks for your pay period. Some people get paid by month, but we're going to say we're a 2-week pay period. So you can type in 14 days, not 114 days. That would be a lot. And you also need to pick your starting point, because that will make sure that your pay period is starting and ending where you want it to. So for us, we're going to say that our start point, just so that the numbers line up correctly, is 12/31/18, because we want those weeks to break up correctly. And so we'll click that, and there we go. Hit OK. And now we have, and you'd have to do change this to pay period, just so it reflects the data correctly. We've got 2-week periods where we can see the data for those regions. So that is a nifty feature. You can basically enter any number of days, and you can manipulate the start and stop of that to kind of get your data grouped in a way that works for you. If the pre-selected options that are provided here don't quite do the trick. So days is the only one you can do that for. You can't do that for any of the other ones, but it is handy if you're trying to work with maybe 3 weeks out of the month or something like that, or maybe just a partial week, or a full week even, because we don't have a week as an option. So that is a handy bit of information there. All right, any questions about grouping by date?
No questions right now.
Okay, need to speed up a little bit. We're getting close to the end of our time. So other grouping, you can also group by things that are not date related. It's not quite as easy, but still quite useful to do. So for example, we want to look at our regions, but we also want to be able to see the totals for the entire northern region and the entire western region and the entire east region, because we have it broken up into 4. So let's say we want to do that. In order to do that, we will scroll on my notes here. Make sure to move the columns so that they're side by side. So we want southeast next to northeast, and that's really easy to do. You can just click at the top here, and you can drag the column. I can actually get it to behave for me. You can then move it over, and you don't need to highlight the whole thing. If you have just the one, it should bring all of it with it. You'll see how you get that little lovely green bar to tell you where you're moving it to. And now we have northeast and southeast next to each other, and northwest and southwest next to each other. So that's the setup for grouping. And then we will highlight the 2 and click on them, right click, and do group. And it will group them together. We want to name our group that we have now East, because it's the 2 of them. And now when we close it up, we can see the grand totals for both northeast and southeast put together as one total for east. And we can do the exact same over here. You want to make sure to highlight the bottom 2 here when you're grouping instead of these top 2, because it won't group properly with the top 2. So we highlight northwest and southwest, right click, group, automatically makes them into a group. We're going to name that west. And now we have our totals for east and west. And we can actually change the name up here so that it's not just region 2, which is very boring, and make it, let's say, east west sales, so that we can see them broken up. And you can name it whatever is useful for you, but that way you can group your numbers in a way that might be more useful when you're presenting the data to somebody or looking at the data yourself. Any questions about grouping that way?
No questions.
Okay, I'm going to undo it so we don't have so many bits to work with. You can also group by row. So we've got, as you look here, we've got 2 pies and everything else is a different type here. So we could group our pies together if we wanted to see our pie numbers. So you just highlight moon pies and panda pies and group them. And we could change that name to pies. If we had more products that we were offering, we could then have, say, a rolls group and a cookies group and a cake group. Since we only have one, of course, that isn't entirely useful, but if you had a bigger business where you sold multiple types of things, this could come in really handy because then you could shrink down and look at the totals for the pies. And then you can see, okay, our pies are doing really great. Our cakes are only doing so much. Our rolls are only doing so much. And, kind of decide if there's maybe a popularity in, oh, everybody loves pies. So that is a handy tool to look at summaries of numbers. All right, so we're going to bounce on to other values that you can work with. So we'll hop over here. Because right now we've been working with sums, lots and lots of sums, but there are other ways to work with the numbers. So first we're going to look at percentages of cases per salesperson. So right now these are just the totals, but we want to see who's bringing in what percentage-wise, so we can kind of put that in perspective. So to do that, we will want to get our number of cases back down here a second time. So we'll have right now 2 numbers of cases, but they're both sums. Well, we want to change one of those to, in the field settings here, so value field settings, we'll get our options that we can change. So we want the percentage. So we're going to see if we can find that. There we go. We want to calculate. And so we're going to do percentage of the grand total. So you can change the values here where you can count, you can find the average, minimum, maximum, that sort of thing. But we're looking show values as, and we're going to go with percentage of grand total. We'll hit OK. And now we can see what percentage each salesperson brings in to the business of the company. So we've got it broken down into percentage of this total amount here. So each of these percent-wise for the total. If you wanted to, you could also just have one of these here if you wanted to just focus on one of them. And you can change the title to percentage so that it's not confusing. There's other options that we can play with. We can also do percentage of cost per salesperson. So let's get rid of our number of cases because we want to just compare percentage, and we'll rename this percentage of cases. And spread that out a little so we can see it. And we'll wrap this text so it's actually legible. There we go. And then we're going to add in our total cost. Let's see, there we go, item cost. Bring that down to our values, and we're going to change it into percentage as well. So we're going to come back over to our value field settings, show values as, and we will change that to also percentage of grand total. There we go. So now we can compare the percentage cost. We can compare how much percentage-wise they brought in money-wise versus how much they brought in total number of products-wise. Now, looking at these, which do you think would be the best for performance reviews, where you want to see how they're helping the company the most? Any ideas on that? Feel free to respond. Would you rather do percentage of the total cost, or would you rather do percentage of the items? You can see there is some slight differences, like Meg over here didn't bring quite as much of the cost in as she did the number of items. So she sold a lot of items, but maybe they were on the lower cost side of the items, like the price for them wasn't quite as much as some of their higher priced items. Whereas Marie over here, she sold maybe not quite as many cases, but she sold more high priced products. Did anybody respond?
Yes, somebody suggested cost. And somebody else wanted to know percentage of cases.
Yeah, so, you know, it really depends on how you're looking at it. If you're looking at it from a how much money has this person brought into the company, the percentage of cost is obviously going to give you the clearer view of who's doing the best. If you're wanting to see who's convincing the customers to buy more stuff, then the number of cases. So it really does depend. I am sure that most businesses focus on the cost side of things just because the bottom line is always the dollar, but you know, it's up to what needs you have. So we are almost out of time, which is a shame.
I'm sorry, we do have a couple of questions that I think you could answer quickly. Somebody asked, once you create column names, will this group name show up in the pivot table fields?
Yes, it actually does. So let's see, at least it should. Let me see if it did that. See. So it doesn't show up in the field list because that hasn't changed, but it shows up down here in the values. The names have changed to match what I've changed them to. Now, if I were to take that out and then try to put it back in, unfortunately, I'd have to reformat it. So if that comes up, if you're not sure if you want to keep it, you can kind of store it in the filters area, and it'll, actually, I take that back. It reverts it back. Well, that's a new thing. It will revert it back to what the actual name of the field is. But if you have it down here in values, or if you have it in columns and rows and you change the name, it will reflect it in here. It won't change here because this is kind of the set area for it, based off of the table that it gets the information from. All right, we didn't have as much time this go around to get into filters and slicers and timelines. So if you're interested in that information, we have a previous recording of this same program from December that I did, that I think we made it all the way to the slicers for that particular section. So I highly recommend checking that out on our YouTube page. You can watch it anytime. It should be up there and waiting for you to use. I believe it's under Excel series rather than specifically pivot tables. It was the fourth one in the series, much like this one. So I would look for that, and it'll go over basic information about traditional filters, using timelines, and slicers, which are really handy to use visually. They work the same way as filters. They're just a little more visually appealing and easier to sort data with, because you can have multiples that do a lot of stuff. So unfortunately, we won't get to that today, but the information is out there on stuff that we've done, as well as if you're interested in more in-depth learning, there are several LinkedIn learning classes that cover Excel in extensive detail. I believe the pivot tables one is at least 3 hours long. And LinkedIn.com used to be lynda.com. So you'll be hearing us refer to it by that much more now, LinkedIn Learning. They've rebranded. But it offers the same services, the same tutorials, and if you've used it before, all of your classes that you've taken have been transferred over. So fear not, your progress has not been lost. So Sharon should be providing that link in the chat for you if you need it. You can also, of course, get it get to it from our website under Research and Learn.
Mm-hmm.
And are there any questions before we go?
There are. There's, let me get right back to that. Somebody asked, is there a future class that you know of or a video recording of how to do VLOOKUPs?
So VLOOKUPs is a little outside of the scope of our formulas and functions class, which is where you'd find that kind of information. It's a little more advanced than what we go through on that section. My recommendation would be to look up the formulas and functions on LinkedIn Learning. And I believe they might cover VLOOKUPs in there. If not, you can also do a book a librarian for a 30-minute session, and we can look into how to do that and then go over it with you during our 30-minute appointment. One-on-one time, great for answering quick questions that you might need some guided help with.
And Meredith, there is somebody who had a question from last week's class, which you probably taught as well. Is there a good way to answer or connect with the person who taught last week's class?
I did teach it, so if they've got a question, I can try to answer it real quick before we go.
Okay. So M&M, if you have a specific question, if you could just type that in the chat or question and answer field, that'd be great.
Yes. Let's see, and let's see if I can get, Sharon, can you get a link to our YouTube page so that they can get quick access to that? It's really easy to find. It's just, you can Google Plano Library YouTube, and that'll be, I believe, like the first link up there, but if you can put that in the chat, we had it.
Let me take a peek at that. Plano Library YouTube.
Yes, and the link to this current class will be available in a follow-up email that should get to you in about 3 to 4 business days. It just depends on how long it takes them to edit it and make it all pretty, and then they'll send it out.
Okay, found that. Let me put that in there.
And if you don't have a chance to get your question to us, then feel free to do a Ask a Librarian, which is on our website under, I believe, the About tab. Let me see if I can pull that up. It's been a hot minute since I've done it. And then they can get back to you with the answer. It's very similar to Book a Librarian, but it's great for short, quick questions. So let me get to that. So under our website.
Yeah, I did put the YouTube link in, and the question about last week's class, M&M said they'll ask another time.
Okay, so I'll put the link here in the chat. This is for both Ask a Librarian and Book a Librarian. There's a link to each form. So if it's a quick question that we can answer by email, we'll get back to you through Ask a Librarian. If you're wanting some more like one-on-one guided help, you can put in a request for a 30-minute session, and we will get back with you and schedule that and do the research necessary to answer your question as thoroughly as possible. All right, well, it's time to go. Thank you so much for joining me, and we hope to see you in future programs. We'll actually be doing a Google series, Google Suite for Business, where we'll be focusing on using Google Docs, Google Sheets, Forms, and what's the last one? Slides, there we go, in the context of businesses. So we'll be looking at how to make brochures, invoices, how to use forms for ordering products, that sort of thing. So it'll be a lot of fun, and we hope to see you at that. In fact, next week is when the first one will start on a Friday. You can check out all of our upcoming programs on our page, planolibrary.org, and there's a little calendar that shows you all of the upcoming programs we have going on. So thank you very much for joining us.